Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to week 11. This week will just be one lecture, and we're talking about state and local governments. We're going to talk about how the role that state and local governments play in enacting public policy and thinking about some advantages and disadvantages of policymaking at the state and local level. So, as a quick review from the questions of federalism, remember the Constitution divides power between the federal and state governments. So certain enumerated powers are expressed and given specifically to Congress and the president, yet the states retain significant authority. And this is, under the idea of the 10th Amendment, that they reserve all non-enumerated powers to the states or to the people. So the states have the power to establish local governments and account for the structure, function, and responsibilities of this governments. They gave states sovereignty over county, municipalities, school, and other districts. Member states have the power to ratify amendments to the Constitution, so they have significant authority. Remember, and federalism is this evolving relationship between the state and the state governments, these semi-autonomous states, and the federal national government. It can be kind of this early period of dual federalism, this separation between these into kind of exclusive spheres of authority. The idea of cooperative federalism, in which the federal government and the state governments work together on policy ends, or and then this kind of devolution or return back to decreasing the role of federal government and turning more authority over to the states. So, all states have a governor that mirror the president, that they are the executive branch. They are the most visible state politician. They hold office singularly and are in office year round, rather than just when the legislature is in session, right? So they are always in the public eye. And often the state constitutions empower the governments vis-a-vis the legislature much more than the president is empowered by the federal constitution. So the governor tends to have more autonomy and more powers with respect to the legislature than the president does with respect to Congress. State executive power is often increased because the state has the governor has a series of formal powers, much like the State of the Union. They give the state address. They propose budgets. They have the veto power, just like the president does. But most have the line item veto, so they can strike down particular pieces of legislation, which the president cannot do. And 30% of governors have an amendatory veto, which allows them to send a bill back to legislature and request specific amendments to it. They can call special sessions of the legislature and pardon commuted sentences for state crimes. They also have a series of informal powers, being the most public state-level politicians, so they can fundraise, campaign for both state and local and national office. And then they have this kind of same executive power. The executive branch does it's not the governors. So the governor is also going to appoint. There's also going to be attorney generals. Often these secretaries of state, all these other kind of executive positions. But unlike the federal level, these are often elected rather than appointed by the governor. States mirroring the federal level, they have legislatures. That all states except for Nebraska have bicameral legislatures, so they have two houses, but the exact structures and composition vary from state to state. According to the National Conference of State Legislatures, Alaska has the smallest lower house with 40 members, but New Hampshire has the largest lower house at 400 members. State senates range in size from 20 members in Alaska to 67 members in Minnesota. And so the size of these institutions can have lots of impacts on representation, right? Larger bodies have smaller legislature to constituent ratios, but larger legislatures also can make policy making more complicated, right? It's harder to get bills passed when there are more potential veto points, more people that you would have to convince to vote for the bill. 15 states have term limits on their legislatures, and there's like a fairly robust debate on whether term limits are good. Lots of political scientists actually think that they're bad, that even though turnover might be good and decrease corruption and increase diversity, that this can lead to the deprofessionalization of legislatures. And this idea of deprofessionalization is that the legislature is not in office full time, that they are not getting the same level of experience. They are not getting the same, you're losing institutional knowledge and network, and you end up making, and you turn kind of government into, like, a concern here is that it's less of a full-time, like, long-term profession and more of kind of rotating cast of characters. So you're not going to be able to have the same effectiveness. So legislatures, much like the Congress, have three main functions: lawmaking, in which they pass laws that govern the state. And every state, except for Vermont, has a balanced budget requirement in their state constitution. And that means that they cannot run a budget deficit. They cannot spend more money than they take in revenue. And this really constrains policymaking at the state level, because they cannot simply write a check that they cannot cash like the federal government can. They have to work much more closely with the governors to get legislation passed, because of the enhanced power governors have as compared to the president. And because legislatures are not highly professionalized, like we talked about with lobbying, they're often part-time, they're often not, have less experience in politics, they're not experts in the policy area. This is often like their first foray into elected office. That creates more opportunities for lobbying groups to try to influence and write legislation. They also have the representation function. Just like in Congress, they try to bring particularized benefits to their districts, right? That in the state that you belong, just like you belong to a congressional district, you also belong to a state legislative district. And so your state or legislative representative is going to try to bring back particular benefits. And they have an oversight function, right? That they are trying to oversee the state bureaucracy and make sure it is accountable to the people, just like Congress does. So there's all sorts of questions of professionalism in state legislatures, and usually they're assessed by the salary, the length of time in session, and staff size. And in all three of these respects, state legislatures, as compared to Congress, have lower salary. Many of them, this is like a part-time job that they still retain other employment. They are not in session full-time. The sessions are much shorter than as compared to Congress, and they can have smaller staffs. So they can have less people like researching and writing legislation, contacting, responding to constituents, etc. All of these are kind of signs that the state legislatures are less professionalized. They have less kind of the tools and resources at their disposal. When we look to local governments, we can think about the relationship between state and local governments. In general, state actions trump local governments. They have supremacy in the same way that the federal government has supremacy over state rules. This is known as Dillon's rule. But at the same time, the doctrine of home rule adds independence to local municipalities to make policy and pass taxes. And these are spelled out in the charter of that municipality. So the city of Los Angeles has its own kind of city government, has its own ability to pass laws, and as long as it doesn't violate state action, is not like superseded by state action, it has a relative amount of independence here. States in general raise most of their money from property taxes, sales taxes, and grants from other levels of government. And this generates lots of inequality across municipalities. As some municipalities that have higher property values are going to have more revenue for spending, right? And municipalities with lower property values are going to have less revenue for spending. And that's going to create these cycles of inequality because it's often the amount of public funding that then boosts the property values in return, right? Better schools, more money for schools, more money for development projects, more money for to attract investments. All these things then boost property values that then creates more revenue for the state government, right? And at the same time, local governments have an incentive to keep taxes low to get people to build businesses and buy homes in the area. And this can generate, while at the same time, there's increasingly demand for more services. So the state or the local governments are kind of caught in these twin competing demands that can generate fiscal crises from which they want to provide more services than they can pay for. So there's three main models if we're looking at the county government. there might be a commission model where the county is governed by an elected commission, where the county commissioners are elected. There's also a council and an administrator model where there's an elected council that then appoint a county administrator to kind of function as the executive branch, where the commission model, like both the executive and legislative functions, are kind of rolled into the county commissioners. And then there's also a council executive model in which both the county council and the executive are elected. Los Angeles has an elected commission made up of a five-person board of supervisors. And the tasks they can perform vary from state to state, but most counties have a courthouse that houses county officials such as the sheriff, the county clerk, the assessor, the treasurer, the coroner, and the engineer. They oversee a lot of the functions of the county government. So the county coroner investigates death. The county clerk is going to keep records of not only elections, but also birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates, etc. And that's all going to be kind of at this county level. Cities also have two different ways that their governments can be organized. Their two main ways are a mayor-council model, where there's an elected mayor and an elected city council, where the city, you elect both a mayor and a city council, and they kind of have a separation of powers there, or a council-manager model, where there's an elected city council and maybe a mayor, but then they choose a city manager as a kind of like a political administrator of the city. Municipal governments are responsible for providing clean water as well as sewage and garbage disposal. They maintain city facilities such as parks, streets. They address zoning and building regulations. They promote the city's economic development, provide law enforcement, public transportation, fire protection. Los Angeles, the city, has a city council mayor model with 15-member city council and a mayor. Now, one way that we can think about the differences among states is by looking at what the political scientists Elazar in 1966 described as different models of state political culture. So the first is a moralistic culture. And states with moralistic political cultures see the government as a means to better society and promote the general welfare. These states tend to expect political officials to be honest and put the interests of the people. They view politics positively, and citizens have kind of focused on anti-corruption measures. It has its origins in the Puritan culture of New England, and as European settlers in that region spread westward to the upper Great Lakes region in the Midwest and West Coast. This is the red on this chart here. In general, these encourage political participation. These states tend to make it easier to vote and have more contested elections. And they tend to prioritize meritocracy, right? The idea that the political system should reward merit rather than just connections. The green states here represent states with an individualistic political culture, and these view government as a mechanism for addressing issues that matter to individual citizens and for pursuing individual goals, right? They want the government to kind of function like the market. The government should provide goods and essential services, but the goal shouldn't be, making it possible for individuals to secure their own private needs rather than the public good. These have origins in non-Puritan European settlers in the Mid-Atlantic, and then moving westward, there's an emphasis on lower taxes and business environment and party loyalty. These are the states that tend to have more political machines here. Finally, Elazar identifies what he calls as traditionalist culture, in which the government is necessary to maintaining the social order. Only elites belong in the political enterprise, and new policies will only be advanced if they reinforce belief and interest of those in power. These are identified in the southern region of the United States as a legacy of enslavement-based economies, views political participation as a privilege rather than a right, and what you end up having is party competition within the dominant party rather than you have competition between, like, in general, more extreme more right and less right Republicans rather than between Republicans and Democrats. Though, of course, in this kind of model might be changing, right? We saw Arizona becoming Democratic. Virginia has for a while been a Democratic state. North Carolina and South Carolina are often considered swing states. Georgia flipped blue in the most recent election, and Florida is often a swing state. So these are not set in stone here. And there are also limits of this theory in terms of like internal migration. As people move across state boundaries become less of a kind of solid identity, and we'll talk about this in a second. People move to different states, like these cultures become less and less fixed. Immigration also, especially immigration of Latin American immigrants into the South, in Texas and in other points of the South, also reshapes these kind of local cultures in different ways by introducing new aspects of the population. So states in general, especially in a world based after devolution, after the 90s, Newt Gingrich's contract with America, that state budgets are far more constrained than the federal government. The balanced budget amendments and incentives to keep lower taxes mean that budgets at the state level are often tight, and states are dependent on federal grants, right? They cannot. And so the devolution revolution of the 1990s shifted the incentive structures for state governments because the federal government is able to kind of really influence public policy by how types of grants it uses, right? So you can the idea. One of the kind of things that happened was temporary assistance for needy families. The TANF program was established as a block grant, and this ends up with states cutting funding because the block grants were lower than previous matching grant programs. So this is a way that, like, oh no, we're providing money. The federal government says that we're providing money for the states to enact these policies, but because it's changed the way that funding is provided, it can influence that policy. Whereas CHIP, the Children Health Insurance Program, was viewed as a matching grant, so that for every dollar that the states spent, the federal government matched that dollar. That led to states expanding the program. So the federal government has a lot that it can do because of these state budget constraints to influence the types of policies that the states pursue. But and so we can definitely see the constraints on state policy making when we're talking about COVID-19. That the state and local governments have primary jurisdiction for public health. That this is not an enumerated power of the federal government in the Constitution. But as we've seen, right, the budget constraints and financial incentives lead to lots of kind of different decisions being made by different states, right? States want to maintain sales and property taxes, right? So they want businesses to be open and businesses to be making money and people spending money in state businesses so that sales tax revenue can go to the state, right? And especially if their budget is being taxed as more people applying for unemployment relief at the state level, they're going to face these fiscal crises, which creates a financial incentive to kind of push more towards economic growth and economic opening over keeping things shut down, over against lockdowns and things like that. There's also the problem of fragmented authority. You have state-wide mandates, but also county-wide mandates, right? Because of this idea of home rule. So that you have conflict between the states and localities. For example, even though California has put a series of measures, including mask mandates and restrictions on indoor dining, Orange County, for example, basically said that it was not going to enforce any of those mandates. And so you get this kind of fragmented authority unless you're going to have the state come in and enforce that law. And COVID-19 is a classic cross-border challenge. It is not simply a matter because people can cross the border and the virus can cross the border. So what happens in another state will affect the health and economic well-being of your state. And so as Duff Brown, this is a quote from a policy study that's quoted in the Duff Brown article, that this is the dark side of federalism and encourages a patchwork response to epidemics. But on the other side, states and localities also have more opportunities for political action. So despite the kind of relative inaction from the federal government and the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord by the Trump administration, more than 400 city leaders have joined the Climate Mayors Association, and 25 states and territories have joined the U.S. Climate Alliance. And both groups have vowed to uphold the country's Paris Pledge, regardless of what the federal government does. And this accounts for about 2/3 of all of the U.S. greenhouse gas emissions in total, suggesting that state and local action can really be significant. So what can states do? Well, states can pass ordinance about building codes and renewable energy portfolios. These are RPS, renewable portfolio standards, right? Requiring that a certain percentage of the state's energy be produced by sustainable energy or carbon neutral energy. They can establish tax and cap and trade programs like California's cap and trade system for greenhouse gases. They can provide tax incentives for electric vehicles, but they're still constrained. They have limited size and jurisdiction, right? They can't affect the action of other states, and they can't like overrule federal law. And that there are real logistical and financial challenges precisely because of these they don't have the ability to solve cross-border problems. They can't implement nationwide programs, and they have limited financial resources by which to take action. So in the optional reading, political theorist Douglas Thompson, in a 2019 article, raises the question of whether or not states are obsolete. He notes that about 95% of the population live in metropolitan areas. So think of like the Los Angeles metro area. That includes more than just the city limits of Los Angeles, but the suburbs and exurbs. And these metro areas can cross state lines. Think about the New York metro area that includes parts of New Jersey. Think about the Chicago metro area that includes parts of Indiana and parts of Wisconsin. And these remain politically and culturally distinct from the non-metro regions of the states, right? Think Central Valley versus Los Angeles versus the Bay Area. You have very distinct identities of California. And as Thompson writes, the US political system does not include institutions of independent democratic self-government at the metropolitan regional scale, right? So the Bay Area, right? Or like kind of Southern California, or the Chicago metro area, or the New York metro area. Nor does it allow for the direct representation of metro areas at the federal level. In sum, the predominant spatial form of population distribution in the United States does not correspond to the domestic territorial boundaries that organize the US system of elected political representation. So our institutions are organized around the idea of states and primary representation being of states. But if our primary affiliation and geographic organization is not the state, right, but these different metropolitan areas that cross state lines that do not have the same type of independent autonomous governance, they're still bound by states and have to share power with the rest of the state, then Thompson suggests that we have an anachronism. And this leads to two key problems. The first is metropolitan malapportionment, that metropolitan areas do not have independent representation at the federal level, right? Los Angeles has to share its senators with the Central Valley and with San Diego and with the Bay Area, despite the fact that these are all relatively distinct and just happen to be in the same state, right? And there's what he calls metropolitan fragmentation, that metro areas are internally divided into distinct municipal governments, right? Think of Chicago, the Chicago metro area. In addition to Chicago, there's also the wealthy suburbs on the North Shore, places like Evanston, places like Highland Park in Chicago, and these are also cross state lines. Southern Wisconsin and Northwest Indiana, part of the Chicago metro area, but not under Chicago City Council, right? And so that these internal divisions create all sorts of challenges for kind of governing Chicago. In the article, he uses the example of gun violence in Chicago, right? That Chicago has very strict gun regulations, but it can't impose those same gun regulations on Evanston or on Waukegan or on Gary, Indiana. And so because of this, he argues that this really affects both the quantity and quality of representation, right? We all know the California versus Wyoming in the US Senate, right? That they both have two senators despite massive population mismatches. But it also suggests that if you look at upstate New York versus the city of New York, they share Senate representation despite having very different political and geographic interests, where many people in upstate New York would have more in common and share similar political interests with people of other Midwestern Rust Belt states, as distinct from the kind of global city of New York. So instead, Thompson argues for some alternatives. And these are fairly speculative. One, he says that we should shift the way that we represent in the Senate from an equal representation of states to a representation of regions, like the LA metro region, the Rust Belt region, the San Francisco metro region, and basically rework the way that Senate works. Now, he says that this is basically not very practical or feasible given the constraints on that, and it's literally written in the Constitution that you cannot take away equal representation in the Senate without the consent of the states, so it's unlikely to happen. But this would potentially provide for better representation at the federal level and creating independent self-governments that are like in between municipalities, in between like state government, in between like city governments or local governments, and the state governments that are regional and transcend this boundary. So having an LA Metro Regional Assembly that would include not just Los Angeles, but also all of the other, not just Los Angeles proper, but all of the kind of suburbs, including parts of neighboring counties as well, all the kind that are kind of impacted by Los Angeles. And we'll talk about whether or not you think these alternatives are viable or a good idea in a discussion section. Next week, we kind of shift gears from institutions to start thinking about justice and citizenship, and we'll be thinking about civil liberties, immigration, and citizenship next week, thinking about the politics of citizenship. And the minute paper question for this week, again, you can go to bit.ly/Pauls101MP and describe one example, not using the examples from lecture, of how state and local governments are constrained in policymaking, and one example of how they might have a unique opportunity. That's it for this week's lecture on state and local governments. I will see you in discussion section, and then next week we will shift gears and talk about citizenship. Take care.